Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. InsyaAllah today me Muhammad Irfan bin Ruslie and my friend Muhammad Hafiz bin Shuhaimi will explain to you about adhesive die attach process, which is the important process in IC packaging. So what is die attach process? Die attach, also known as die mount or die bond, is the process of attaching the die or silicon chip onto the die pad or die cavity of the support structure of semiconductor package. Actually, there are three common die attach process. First is adhesive die attach, second is eutectic die attach, and third one is glass-free attach. So without further ado, let's look to adhesive die attach process. Adhesive die attach process is the process where we want to attach the die onto the die pad or die cavity by using the adhesive material. The adhesive material that we will use is epoxy material. That's why it is called epoxy die attach, where epoxy will act as a glue to stick the die attached onto the die pad or substrate. So the step involved is, the first one is epoxy dispensing. Epoxy dispensing is the step where the die attached epoxy is dispensed in control volume by dispenser to the substrate. The key word is control volume. It is mean that the volume of the epoxy dispensed onto the substrate is not too little and also not too much, but just enough volume for the die to attach onto the substrate. Besides that, the viscosity of the epoxy has to be controlled. And the next step is die picking. Die picking is the step where the die will be directly picked from the wafer after the wafer sewing process. The die will be picked by using the vacuum pick-up tool. Pick-up tool will lift up the die by using the vacuum, and at the same time, the ejector needle system will push against the backside of the wafer to eject the die. And then the next step is die attach or die placing, where the die attach machine will send the die to the appropriate position and load the die on the substrate that had been dispensed with epoxy material. In this step, die bonding pressure has to be controlled, and after the die is loaded onto the substrate may be heated to facilitate partial curing of the epoxy die attach. And then the next step is epoxy curing. So the die bonded substrate may need to send for curing in oven in order to stabilize the polymer of the epoxy. So in this step, the curing temperature and the pressure of the drying oven is play important role in this step. And the last step is inspection. Inspection is needed to be done by using microscope with 30 times magnification right after the curing process in order to detect any failure on the die. If any failure is detected, the die will be discarded. Most common failure are die lifting, die cracking, adhesive shorting, bond lifting, die scratching, and die metallizing smearing. So for the next part of this discussion, I will pass to my friend Muhammad Hafiz bin Shuhaimi to continue our presentation. That's all from me.
Greetings to Dr. Sharma, I am Hafiz and I will continue with animation flowchart. Okay, after the green flag has been pressed, the program will continue with title page, and there will be start button, and after that button is pressed, the program will have two buttons on the bottom left, which is to go to the front page, next page or previous page to navigate throughout this program. Okay, this program consists of three parts, which are introduction, process flow, and the attached result. Here, the program continues with intro page 2 until 4 and then enter the process flow 1. Okay, The next button is pressed until process flow 1 and then process flow 2A, where the user will need to choose the epoxy pattern design for our die attach process. Okay, so there are three choices: too little, just enough, and too much. Okay, while we are doing research about this epoxy die attach, we failed to find the calculation for this, so we just use these words for representation. After choosing any of the pattern, the user will continue with process flow 2B until process flow 4. Okay, after the user reaches process flow 4, which is the die is ready to be cured, the program continues with heat curing process, starting with heat curing animation. The animation of curing epoxy adhesive started when the user is required to enter the temperature and the value of pressure. Okay, so after the user entered the value of temperature and pressure, the program will then decides whether the temperature entered is within the range of 120 to 175, and also the pressure whether it's within the range 5 to 10 psi, and also the epoxy pattern whether it is just enough or other than that. Okay, if all these conditions are met, then the epoxy curing, the die attaching process is a success. If not, then it will show failure. After the result is shown whether success or failure, the user can retry by pressing the previous button to go to the process flow 4 to change their variables, whether it is temperature or pressure, or maybe they can press the previous button to change their epoxy pattern design. Apart from merely showing success or failure, the program also explains the reasons of success and failure of the process. As we can see here, there are 5 types of failure that is available in this program with different types of variables caused by different types of variables. I will explain the types of failure later. We will proceed with program source code. And also variable calculation. This is the title page of our program. Here is the source code of our start button that will change the page. And here are the codes for the remaining objects on the title page. For this one is for playing song, gliding the image, for animation, and also the others are for the signal to when to hide or show the objects. This is the first intro page, and these are the animation code for Devin, our friend here. The source codes for the buttons inside this program, throughout this program. Intro page 2, source code for the picture, intro page 3 and 4. Then we will continue with the next part, which is process flow, starting with page 1, source code, and here is process flow 2A, where the user need to press any button to choose the epoxy pattern design. So here is the variable calculation for the epoxy variable. Okay, if the user choose just enough, then the program will set epoxy variable to 2. If too little, then 1. If too much, then 3. Page 2b is where the animation of epoxy dispensing occur. This is the source code for the epoxy. There are actually 3 types of object like this, the different patterns of epoxy. The variable will decide which one will come out on the substrate. Process flow 3, putting the dye on the substrate. And process flow 4, where the epoxy is ready to be cured. The next one is the heat curing animation, where the dye is put into the oven, the source code. Then the user will need to enter the temperature and pressure. The source code to ask for the variables, heat curing animation and height variables, inspection animation, and the source code for that. Now comes the third part of this program, which is the results, showing whether it is a success or a failure. This is the page for explanation for success, and this is the variable calculation to determine whether it is a success or not. The recipe for success has been told in the third introduction page earlier. Here is the failure type 1 page. The cause is excessive epoxy applied. Type 2 failure page. The cause is insufficient epoxy. Type 3 failure page. Caused by wrong curing condition. Failure type 4 page. Caused by excessive epoxy applied and also inadequate curing process. And finally, the type 5 failure page, which is caused by insufficient epoxy and also inadequate curing process.
So, as a simple conclusion for our discussion today, every variable on each step in this process should not be taken lightly. All things that happens in this process had been calculated precisely in order to make a successful process. Volume of epoxy used, the curing temperature, and the pressure of drying oven are one of many variables that can affect the process. That's all for our presentation today. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.